and everyone is taking all necessary precautions to keep themselves and their families safe. This is an extremely difficult time that we are going through, and unprecedented times, which requires unprecedented precautionary measures as well. And assuming that we have a very young audience, I will urge everyone to register themselves for vaccination as soon as we become eligible in from 28th of April. I think that's also going to be one major thing that I'll be talking about, even from an economic perspective, as part of the conversation. But I'm very happy to be here as part of this annual finance convention, and I'm looking forward to very engaging feedback coming in from the participants, especially on a trying weekend. Let's try to make this as engaging as possible. I'd love to get feedback, even if anyone wishes to stop me in the middle, and if it gets too technical, one can put that in the chat box, and I could possibly I could change my way of explaining it at that very moment. So that would probably be some cues for the moderator, that if at any point anyone feels that they're a bit lost, because I am going to make this a bit technical. If that feels a bit too technical to understand, then please stop me in the middle, and I'll hope to communicate it in the best way possible. Yeah.
Yeah, ma'am, perfectly. We'll have our host introducing you first and going with the formal session. So after that, we can begin with your keynote session now.
Yeah.
But you can begin with the...
Okay. Good evening, everyone. FinGen, Finance and Investment Cell of Ramanujan College, presents its premier flagship event, Zenith 2021, the annual finance convention. It is one of the most happening and much awaited events in the entire DU circle, where we get to encounter with enlightening visions, and we try and inculcate those in our daily lives. It provides us a platform to interact with visionaries like you, who can nurture the mind of the youth of our society. On behalf of entire FinGen fraternity, I earnestly welcome Sanjana Kadyan ma'am, who is the Deputy Director of Macroeconomic Division of Department of Economic Affairs. Although ma'am needs no introduction, but still, we'd like to share a little more about her to our audience. After completion of her graduation from Lady Shri Ram College, ma'am did her MA and MPhil in economics from JNU with distinction. Then she worked as the assistant professor in Lady Shri Ram College, and after which she went for officer training program in Indian Economic Services, where she ranked 1 in probability training program. Later, she was appointed as the assistant advisor to infrastructure policy and finance division under Ministry of Finance. And as we all know, she is currently working as the deputy director. We welcome you, ma'am. Now I would request our convener, Mr. Arnav Kumar, sir, to address our chief guest and audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernali. And ma'am, since you have such a background from Delhi University, and these are your younger colleagues, younger juniors who are on the same path. Many of them, in fact, are doing economics honors, and they look forward to joining and continuing in economic services and serving the country. So from both the career perspective as well as the topic, we would love to hear from you, and I will not take more time. We again welcome you on behalf of the college, and stage is all yours.
Okay, great. As far as mentoring is concerned, I'll probably keep the last part of my conversation for the mentoring, particularly if people are interested on that front. Dr. Arnav, it's absolutely wonderful to be here. And I would probably just share my screen, and you may let me know if it's visible to everyone. Second. Is the screen visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. So I think the idea that so I had a chat with FinJan on the nature of topics that people were actually very much interested in knowing, and we brainstormed on it for 2 or 3 times, and we came to this one, which was a Keynesian approach to post-pandemic growth financing, a boon or bane. Now, this may actually sound like a very complex topic, especially for people who are not from economics, but it is actually the most simple and most obvious thing that is happening around us right now. And I'm going to get to understanding what the Keynesian framework is, what growth financing is, and what it means, particularly in this post-pandemic, pretty much within the pandemic phase that we find ourselves in right now. To understand that, I think we would broadly want to understand the macroeconomics of COVID. So the COVID is actually a very, very unusual macroeconomic shock. And why is that? So even for people who do not belong to economics, you'd understand that there are shocks like supply shocks to an economy and demand shocks to an economy. More often than not, recessions are understood in the form of either supply shocks, that you have a very sharp supply reduction in the economy, or you understand it as a demand shock where households and firms like you and I actually start demanding much lesser than the overall production in the economy. COVID, on the other hand, is actually a very unique and unprecedented health shock, which has translated into a very messy combination of disaggregated sectoral supply shocks and demand shocks, which is why policy response to COVID-19 has been challenging, which is why it is consistently evolving as the pandemic is evolving. And we need to understand the basics of this to understand the policy framework that has been adopted and is going to be adopted by governments across the world in response to it. So the key point here is that we see different sectors, we see supply shocks and demand shocks moving together, and we see all of them as disaggregated. So with these three things, where does the complexity come in? So there is something called Say's law in economics, which is a very simple classical economics law, which says supply creates its own demand. So the idea essentially is that every time there is demand for something in the economy, producers respond to it and actually produce the same, till actually the supply becomes equal to demand. This was a classical law that existed prior to John Maynard Keynes emerging as a macroeconomist at the time of Great Depression. Now, in today, how do you see this law changing? Do you see supply creating its own demand right now in times of COVID? Probably not. And a very interesting anecdote to that is that supply is actually creating its own excess demand right now. And how do we understand that? Now, COVID-19 came in, and in response came one major common policy response across countries, and that was a lockdown. What does a lockdown do? A lockdown was a very large negative supply shock in the economy. When that took place, that actually could possibly be triggering an aggregate demand shortage subsequently that leads to a further contraction in output and employment in the economy, which is much, much bigger than the original lockdown-driven supply shock itself. Now, I'll get down to what this means in simple terms. Let's go through the chain. What happens is, for instance, imagine there was a lockdown in sector A. So a supply shock took place in sector A and output stopped in sector A. Consequently, labor supply got reduced in sector A, which was essentially a supply shock that took place. What happens then? In sector A, workers lose their incomes and jobs because production is shut. What happens then? The workers in that sector, their consumption drops, especially those workers, not workers like me. Workers, I am not a liquidity constrained worker. I am a worker belonging to the government sector who receives continuous income. But you have workers in sector A who are liquidity constrained, who actually live on daily wages, or who have very high MPC. What is MPC? It's the marginal propensity to consume. If I give you 1 rupee, how much do you consume out of it? So the poor actually consume almost 80% out of that 1 rupee, vis-a-vis the middle class, which consumes somewhere around 50%, and the rich class, which consumes close to 20 to 30%. So we are talking about sector A and workers in that sector A, particularly the liquidity constrained informal sector workers, whose consumption dropped significantly in response to the drop in income and jobs. Now, this is the first stage effect that happened in response to a lockdown, which we saw last year in the same time. This is almost like a deja vu right now. Just imagine going back in time, exactly 1 year back, what happened. And we found ourselves in that nationwide lockdown, which is happening in Delhi right now. Subsequently, what happens is that if you want aggregate demand to not fall, sector A's demand has fallen because sectors A's workers do not have jobs. So their demand has fallen. So if everything else remains the same, aggregate demand would fall. To compensate for that, other sectors which were not affected by lockdown, for instance, agriculture, sectors which were relatively unaffected sectors or exempted sectors from the lockdown, those workers would have to increase their demand for the goods that they are producing. So you obviously cannot consume sector A goods. You have to consume sector B goods, which are the unaffected sectors. So to keep overall demand the same, farmers or any other exempted sector would actually have to consume a lot more of their own goods. But does that happen? No, because in response to a crisis, even a farmer or any exempted sector worker is going to rebalance his consumption. What did you do in response to a lockdown? You either started consuming less of air transport and more of a good like groceries. So you rebalanced your consumption from affected sectors to unaffected sectors. What else did you do? You felt that there is too much uncertainty around you. So you actually stopped your consumption today thinking I will consume tomorrow or day after when things become more normal. That is intertemporal consumption. So every consumer, even if he belonged to an unaffected sector, started doing this. So actually, even if the shock was only in the affected lockdown sector, it's transmitted into this aggregate demand shock in the other sectors, which were unaffected sectors. And if I definitely do this consumption postponement, which definitely happened in the first quarter of FY 2021, when you saw that sharp 24.4% decline in our GDP, and if you would have seen the components of GDP, you saw a sharp fall in consumption spending, you saw a sharp fall in investment spending. So what was happening there? You had supply shocks, so you saw your GVA definitely declining, but you had demand shocks coming in supposedly unaffected sectors as well, because eventually there was no sector which was technically unaffected. And this is how the COVID shock becomes actually a very, very unique and very, very difficult to respond to kind of a shock, because you actually see these intertwined supply and demand shocks across the economy. Now, why am I talking about this? Because this holds relevance for policy. This holds relevance for the kind of tools that one needs to respond to such a crisis. One way of doing this is actually to try and understand which sectors are supply constrained and which sectors are demand constrained. One way of it's not very easy to do this, to distinguish sectors across that, because you will see those forces taking place in all sectors. But such exercises can be done to understand, for instance, the food sector, the food services sector, or the tourism sector, the hotels and accommodation sector became supply constrained sectors, because the entertainment services, you had rental and leasing services, these services were not allowed during lockdown, or they were very contact intensive sectors. So they actually faced a significant reduction in supply, which was forced by the lockdown. On the other hand, you have demand constrained sectors. Like I stopped using water transport, I stopped using rail transport, I stopped using air transport or road transport. So you see those effects in oil prices. When the demand for oil actually significantly declined in FY 2021 in the first half, oil and gas became a demand constrained sector. Of course, there were supply effects as well, but we're talking about relative, which one becomes more strong in which period. So when you track that, you try to assess, okay, which policy is going to work better for which sector. And I'm going to come to that. And that's where the relevance of Keynesian frameworks comes in. It is important to distinguish between what kind of constraint is working on in a sector. Because if you try to impose a policy which is boosting demand in a supply constrained sector, then what will happen? What is a demand boosting policy? A demand boosting policy could be pushing in government spending, that is a Keynesian policy, or lowering interest rates. But if you do that in a sector which is currently supply constrained, facing supply chain disruptions, that is going to translate into inflation because you don't have a problem of demand there. On the other hand, you actually, if you try to have supply side policies for sectors that are dealing with demand problems, for instance, passenger vehicles. So our demand for passenger vehicles dipped significantly because it almost seemed like leisure consumption for us at that point. So if we would have adopted a supply boosting policy for the auto sector during the first quarter, that would actually not have been very effective because we would anyway not buy cars when we are not even sure of whether we are going to be having income in the next quarter or not. So in such times, the typical Keynesian framework of large aggregate demand stimulus becomes a bit questionable, and there is enough literature evidence on this. Whatever I'm speaking of is coming from well-backed literature, where even this is very easy to understand, even for someone who's not from economics. It is a simple demand versus supply thing. If you see the two lines in the chart, the flatter line, the C plus I plus G, is nothing but aggregate demand, and the 45-degree line is nothing but the line where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. So for instance, imagine that we are somewhere here, which means that demand is actually the point where demand should be equal to supply is here, but actually we find ourselves here. So initially imagine that demand is greater than supply. So what happens then? When demand is greater than supply, firms start producing more. Firms start producing more, you start moving to the right. When you move to the right and you reach here, you'll realize that supply increased by this much, but demand actually only increased by this much. Why? Because when output increases by 1 unit, incomes increase by 1 unit, but consumption increases only by 0.8 units because you don't consume everything or you don't invest everything that you get. You save a part of it. So that comes out as a leakage. So this is actually the Keynesian framework, that when the government spends more money today, if the government spends 100 rupees today, that translates into 100 rupees of income for all of us today. We consume 80% of it tomorrow, which translates into 80 rupees of income tomorrow. Then in the next period, we consume 80% of 80 rupees. So this is how this mechanism moves until demand becomes equal to supply. This is a very simple Keynesian framework of a demand push, or basically how the two forces become equal in response to any kind of spending that is done. Now, does this necessarily work in COVID? Maybe not. And why is that? Because we are saying that if the government or anyone, for instance, spends today, I want first round, second round effects of this adjustment to happen. So today, if the government gives me, I belong to a sector that has been shut. So I don't have any income from there, but the government provides me a cash transfer. So that gives me a cushion, a temporary cushion to actually consume a bit currently and in the next period. But that does not translate into income for me. Why? Because my employment is still not there, right? This is just a temporary income measure, which is a cushion. It doesn't mean that the spending that the government did in terms of the cash transfer translated into jobs, which translated into continuous income, which translated into me consuming more and more. So if your unit is shut because of a lockdown, or if it keeps opening and closing down, your cycle of income is still unstable. Therefore, the second stage effects of fiscal spending today may not be as neat as something that you saw during Great Depression. What happened during the Great Depression? There was no demand across the world for any of the goods. You had too much supply and no demand. So what did they tell you? Go out there, dig holes and fill them up. We're offering you employment that is going to give you some money, and just go and demand the goods out there, and the economy is going to start reviving. That's the simple idea, simple yet classic idea of Keynesian economics. But in COVID, when you actually have supply shocks and demand shocks moving in together, this becomes a lot more nuanced. While this still holds, it becomes a lot more nuanced. You cannot have an aggregate demand stimulus policy across the board, because you have differential effects of that crisis on affected sectors versus unaffected sectors. Some sectors are more affected than others. So it's not like a broad-based aggregate demand problem that we have right now. And I have proof for this. How can we say that this is not a broad-based aggregate demand problem? Just look at our high-frequency indicator. Any of the high-frequency indicators that we have, you look at agriculture, you will see, if you just look at, you don't even look at the bars, just look at the lines in all the charts. I'll just quickly make you go through it. Any of the indicator actually started picking up immediately after the first quarter, some slowly, some much faster. I wouldn't want to get into the shape of the recovery, but the nuance point that I'm trying to make is that if it was a consistent aggregate demand problem, then we would not have actually seen a quick revival after the first quarter in any of the high frequency indicators. Whether you look at domestic sales for tractors and fertilizers, you look at Manrega. Now, Manrega was what? It's a classic Keynesian policy that was adopted in response when you knew that returning migrants are back in their homes and they don't have jobs over there. They left the jobs that are there in urban areas, a problem that we are going to face even right now, and hoping not to face it as aggressively as we faced it in the last year. So what was done? You were actually having a rural employment program, which is nothing but a Keynesian policy, which is to generate demand in the rural areas. You actually give them work within the area that they stay in, and which provided that necessary cushion to actually, in terms of the incomes, that it could translate into that cycle of consumption and further income. I don't know what's happening there. Can you also see a strange red web?
We can see that, ma'am. Actually, we disabled annotations the other day, but I'm not sure why this is happening. Let me sort it out, ma'am, in a couple of seconds.
Because I didn't touch my. I don't know why this happened, but okay. Should I stop sharing and? Yeah, I think it's fine now. Yeah, so going back, the simple idea is that we never had, and we're still not having, an aggregate demand problem. So the Keynesian framework, solely an aggregate demand Keynesian framework, is not that has been adopted across the world, including India. You actually look at industry, you see all of those recoveries are actually showing that if we had solely an aggregate demand problem, then without having large fiscal, extremely huge fiscal relief, we wouldn't have been seeing this pickup. It was actually an intertwined effect of supply and demand that was taking place across differential sectors, that policy response also needed to be targeted in that sense. So coming back to, I hope that there's not too much confusion about this, but we could get back to this in the questions post the session. So the bottom line that I'm talking about is that in a crisis like COVID, this is not a typical recession that we are seeing. This is an atypical recession that we are seeing, where it is extremely critical to constantly visualize how the demand and supply shocks are differential across sectors. Because conventional monetary policy or conventional fiscal policy, broad-based fiscal and monetary policies may boost aggregate demand, But in the presence of very different supply shocks, like a supply shock in Maharashtra right now is very different from no supply shock in Assam right now. So a broad-based fiscal policy uh, for both Assam and Maharashtra is not going to it may boost aggregate demand for sure, but it's not going to resolve the very specialized problems that Maharashtra is facing right now in their own state. And this is why governments across the world, including India, responded to the crisis with very targeted or hope to utilize very targeted fiscal and monetary policies, a blend of that. And what does that mean in India's case? During the first wave, what we did was that we had a four-pronged strategy. We had a four-pronged strategy, the first one being saving lives. And why this is important from an economic perspective. So the saving lives is all the health-related measures and the containment-related measures and the relief measures of food grains and R&D grants for COVID-19 vaccines, free cooking gas, cylinders, cash payments. These are actually measures to save lives, not just health, but people who could have possibly died because of lack of food. So, which is something that has been announced again right now. A critical fiscal relief to save lives is not just a temporary cushion, but actually a very critical macroeconomic stabilization tool in a quarter where you see a massive supply shock. The supply shock that I talked about just before, that supply shock, which translates into a huge aggregate demand shock as well. So you need those very targeted fiscal relief measures for people who are liquidity constrained, who are having extremely high marginal propensity to consume, people like informal sector workers, migrant laborers, urban poor, and the contact intensive sectors that have actually faced the greatest brunt of this particular pandemic in that particular quarter. The other strategy was the saving livelihoods, which was the policy dilemma that we faced, because we knew that the lockdown and the containment policies, which is a dilemma that state governments have faced right now, including Delhi, that in the process of saving lives, you're actually uh, going to actually exacerbate the problem of saving livelihoods. So you consequently need very targeted policy measures on that front as well, which was either in terms of giving direct cash transfers to women, to disabled, to actually poor farmers, PM Kisan. You had support being given to construction workers. You had affordable renting housing complexes schemes that people, once things normalized, people could actually be moving into working towards finding an affordable home. Or you had street vendors programs, which was EV credit being given to street vendors. These are contact intensive sectors, but which would have actually been very, very much affected. So when easy credit comes available, that liquidity constraint becomes weaker. The day-to-day liquidity constraint becomes weaker. So even the employment program that was there for the returning migrants was actually Manrega, and the Garib Rozgar Abhiyan was actually aimed towards this particular aspect of saving livelihoods, which from a macroeconomic perspective, because that is something that I deal with, is actually very critical to deal with that demand shock that comes in response to the supply shock. And the third one was saving businesses. Now, this is where monetary and fiscal coordination started coming in, because businesses saving is extremely critical for two things. One, you need to incentivize a firm to not lay off their workers. That is number one. As an example, you may be having house helps in your home. You know that a lot of house helps would not either leave the city and go back to their homes when they feel that the lockdown is too long, because they don't see that regular income coming in, and that their rentals, everything becomes a problem for them. So why are people on a humanitarian ground also being persuaded to actually continue their income cycle even when the lockdown exists right now, even for house help? Essentially, house help is a business for us. So we're saving that business by actually continuing that income cycle for them. But you actually have a lot of migrant laborers who are working, or informal sector workers who are working in urban areas, which is where the differential COVID effects also come in. The urban centers having large-scale migrants working in businesses. So it was very, very important to incentivize businesses to A, not lay off workers, B, to actually keep their liquidity going so that they actually don't shut down. So even if the workers return, they don't come back to a bankrupt firm because they will anyway lose their jobs. And so you had credit guarantee support, you had liquidity injection. This is stuff that was being done by the RBI. The monetary injection that is being done specifically for firms to save businesses. And you also had tax on the government side. You had tax credits being given, tax relief being given to businesses. You had partial credit guarantee schemes being given. This is also part of the Keynesian framework, where on the government side, you're actually pushing either spending or reducing the tax effects for firms to actually save them. And lastly, but one that is extremely critical post the surging wave that we're seeing right now is actually the structural reforms. Why are all of these structural reforms, whether it is across agriculture or labor or airspace or power or private participation, privatization, production-linked incentive scheme for the champion sectors across manufacturing? Why is this critical? From a macroeconomic perspective, it's critical because we wish to raise potential output of India in the coming years. So there is a difference between the actual output that we see right now, which is in contraction, and the potential output, or what we can at best, if all our resources are being utilized to the best, what would be our output be? What would our output be? That's the potential output. So when you actually unleash all these energies or these open up all these blockages that are there across different sectors through structural reforms, effects of those are actually witnessed in potential output in the next 4 to 5 years. So that was another prong to the strategy, apart from the fiscal and monetary policy coordination that was witnessed. Now, if we come to the situation, this is going to be my last part, which is what now? We see ourselves in the middle of a surging wave. The surging second wave is differentiated across, again, it is differentiated across sectors, across cities, across states. So the economic impact, we know the health impact is absolutely massive and unprecedented. And there are a lot of measures being taken by respective state governments and the central government in coordination right now. But from what I'm going to be talking about is from an economic perspective. How should we possibly be responding to this second wave? So what happened last year versus what is happening this year? So last year we witnessed a nationwide lockdown at this particular point of time. So the supply shock that I talked about was actually very, very homogeneous. Everything was shut. Sector A that I spoke of was almost everything. So the sector B, the unaffected sector, was actually very, very few sectors, because you had a nationwide lockdown and it was gradually opened up over time in a homogeneous fashion. So it wasn't like there were differential responses. But today, there are differential COVID-19 restrictions, /lockdown, /night curfews, differential policies across states. So the second wave economic impact is also going to be differentiated. The other thing where this is different is this is going to be more intertemporal, because the first wave, we knew that the first wave, the lockdown, how the lockdown moved over time across in FY 2021 was actually you didn't see different states being hit at different points in time, because the same kind of effects, more or less the same kind of effects of the lockdown from a macro perspective could be seen over time. If there was a lockdown, it was a lockdown everywhere. If it was gradual unlocking, there was gradual unlocking everywhere. If there was a returnee migrant problem, it was also very broad-based. All migrant origin states faced it, which is close to 8 states. So I wouldn't say that one state was experiencing a very different shock from another state. But today, in the second wave, it's very different. There are some states like Delhi, Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, which are facing, Karnataka, which are facing an extremely intense health shock and a macroeconomic shock, vis-a-vis a state like Assam or J&K or Northeast, who are not experiencing those shocks with the same intensity and are even not adopting restrictions in response with the same intensity because they don't need it. We still don't know how this is going to pan out in the coming quarter, but as things stand right now, in terms of the effect that I can probably estimate in the coming quarter, this effect is definitely going to be a lot more intertemporal, because some states are going to continue with the restrictions for a longer period of time based on their own assessment vis-a-vis others. This is where the second wave becomes different again. And the third thing is that this wave's effect has one thing different, and one thing that we are pinning our hopes on is vaccination. The vaccination is actually our biggest macro lever for FY 21-22. Ramping up vaccination is not only going to help you reduce the morbidity shock or the health mortality shock that we are experiencing right now, but is actually going to dissipate the supply shock that we face because of a lockdown and the consequent demand shock. When I get vaccinated, which I hope I do very quickly, I know for a fact that I will be a lot more protected in response to COVID, even if I contract it again. How does that transform my behavior as an economic agent? I will be a lot more assured about my consumption decisions in the next quarter. I will be a lot more assured about the anxieties that I experience because of the possible health effects on my loved ones. The overall uncertainty effect that actually pan out with the ramped up vaccination program is something that you are seeing globally. The countries like Israel, UK, and US that have actually experienced close to 50% of their population being vaccinated are actually seeing very robust economic recovery. India as on date till March has also had robust economic recovery. And there is no doubt about it in terms of the overall stage from where we were when we faced the first wave to where we are now. But with the current situation, there is definitely going to be the effect is definitely going to be a lot more intensified, but the vaccination ramping up is actually going to make this a lot more enduring. The effect is going to be a lot more enduring, which is something the Keynesian framework that we're going to talk about now actually has to focus on this one aspect, both for the central and the state governments. The most enduring stimulus that is there for FY 21-22 is aggressively ramping up vaccination, whether it is in terms of creating more centers, something that has been announced today, right now, just an hour back, that the private health centers need to be increased across all states so that people face less and less vaccine hesitancy in going and getting themselves vaccinated. The more easy it is for people from the age group of 18 to 45 to get vaccinated, the faster this is going to be, because let us remember that this is a voluntary exercise and we need to constantly nudge our population to get themselves vaccinated and build that trust in these areas in these times of trust deficit that we have, build that trust that it is extremely crucial for them to get vaccinated. So from a macroeconomic perspective, this is not fiscal relief. This is going to be the biggest fiscal stimulus, which is going to matter the most for India. The other thing is the fiscal relief right now, which is urgent, which is much needed, and which is being announced as we talk, is basically about, again, giving the workers that are liquidity constrained and have high marginal propensity to consume, workers being incentivized to stay back, workers being given free food grains. Delhi and Maharashtra have announced cash transfers for registered construction workers. These things are going to happen again and should happen again, because this critical fiscal relief is needed for the supply chains to not get disrupted for more than a quarter. So that is the additional Keynesian framework that you're going to be witnessing that we hope to witness in the coming quarter. At the same time, states and center included are strained because of their fiscal deficits, and they are strained. The amount of spending that governments can do is not unlimited. and it is critically dependent on yields. Yields is nothing but the rate at which you can borrow money. So it becomes important that RBI, from the monetary policy perspective, continues to perform the role of yield management to keep yields low, so that both center and states can borrow at reasonable rates and use that money to provide the necessary fiscal relief that would be needed in response to this surging wave. The other thing is that we don't need to do anything new, because there is a lot that is there in the pipeline. Capital expenditures have been budgeted much higher for both central and state governments in the current year. That is how the union budget was structured. That is how the packages have been structured. There is a focus on pushing capital expenditure a lot more than consumption expenditure. And why is that? You build, when the government spends rupees 100, it makes more sense to spend that on an infrastructure project than to actually spend it on something which is going to be consumed immediately, because that has much higher multiplier effects. So that has been the focus of the underlying packages, so that our potential output gets raised in the next 2 to 3 years. When whether you see the national infrastructure pipeline, we actually see the trends of capital expenditure for the center in the last 2 quarters. The focus is towards pushing capital expenditure a lot more, so that those Keynesian effects that we're talking about, the graph that I showed of adjustment mechanism moving from demand to supply and coming, that is much faster for infrastructure projects, because 100 rupees going into an infrastructure project translates into a lot more jobs, a lot more income, a lot more consumption, and that adjustment becomes much, much quicker. That's the fiscal multiplier that we are talking about. And lastly, from the external sector side, so this is the domestic challenges that we are dealing with. We have a massive health crisis that we are dealing with right now, and you have the consequent domestic economic challenges of it. But equally important from a macroeconomic perspective is external sector. What is going to be happening on the external side? The global economy is booming now, is recovering significantly with vaccination ramping up. And this is not just true for advanced economies. Vaccination needs to be ramped up across developing economies. The majority of developing economies do not have access to vaccination. Even India, as part of its vaccine Maitri mission, has actually provided vaccines to close to 90, more than 70 countries, and for many countries for free. Now, this may actually not seem like a fiscal stimulus, but it actually is a global fiscal stimulus, because these countries contribute to exports and imports for our nation. Everyone is connected in that sense, that nobody can grow completely at the expense of others. So when the global economy currently is booming, on the external side, we continue to be very strong throughout FY 2021, and our exports and imports have recovered very strongly. So that sort of a cushion is definitely going to be coming from the external side when the other countries are doing well, and we will be able to focus a lot more strongly on our domestic economic challenges and health challenges that we're experiencing right now. So that would be all from my side regarding how the Keynesian framework looks like. There's no question of it being a boon or bane. It's always been the need of the hour in response to any crisis, but this crisis is a lot more unprecedented and a lot more complex. So typical across the board policies, whether monetary or fiscal, pushing aggregate demand across the board, both literature and actual policy evidence have shown that it is actually the more targeted the policies are, the better they are in terms of having sustainable economic recovery. And that's also the direction that is going to be taken by governments, including India, in the coming quarters. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was a really intriguing session, and I hope that we could take a lot from it. So now I would request that all those who are willing to ask questions, please drop in your questions in the chat box. Meanwhile, we have selected few questions. So the first question is, supply deficiency is an eternal aspect of Indian economy. Even if the pandemic subsides, how will India actually capitalize on the right opportunities and focus on sustainable growth and development?
Okay, so supply deficiencies, can I be heard?
Yes, you are audible.
So supply deficiencies, again, it's a very sectoral question in that sense. So for instance, if we look at agriculture and we look at the problem of food inflation, we know that, since decades, we've actually had a supply-driven food inflation problem. Because we have problems not from the production perspective, but we have problems from the marketing and distribution perspective. We have, which actually translates into food inflation seasonally over the year. You have that typical cobweb happening in the agricultural sector because of those marketing and distribution issues. Now, this supply side problem is again a structural problem, and structural supply side problems only need structural reforms. And they actually need to be executed very significantly to actually see those results. So the faster you see the implementation and execution of the gamut of structural reforms that we've seen, the focus definitely is to actually have those blockages, the supply side blockages that exist, whether it's the production linked incentive scheme, which is for the 10 champion manufacturing sectors. What you're essentially trying to do is to actually get rid of the supply side constraints for those particular manufacturing sectors by providing them incentives to produce more, to give them ease of doing business. Now, these are supply side measures to actually make it easy for any firm like yours or mine to do business in this country. So it's a general question, but the general answer would be that you need these structural reforms to actually be executed in their spirit in the coming year and the coming 2 to 3 years to actually see those effects of, dipping supply side deficiency problems in our economy. Yeah. I don't think I can hear you. Hello.
Sorry, I just was on mute. So the next question is, how should the government finance its intervention, by raising fiscal deficit or by levying increased taxes?
That's a question that you should answer rather than the government. What would be your preferred route to that as a consumer? I'm pretty sure nobody sitting here would want higher taxes. That is always a very politically sensitive issue, and B, in a recession, raising taxes is actually an economically inappropriate policy response, because you're going to be doing exactly the opposite. We know that fiscal resources are scarce. So the better approach in the coming 5 years would actually be to expand our tax base rather than raising tax rates. We need to tax a lot more people who should be in the tax base but are not in the tax base, rather than actually raising tax rates. Because if you see our income tax system, it is reasonably progressive. The rich are taxed a lot more than the poor. But because our tax base is so small, we only have close to 3% of our 3 to 4% of our population that is actually paying taxes. So it becomes important. Because of that, you're compelled to have regressive taxes like consumption taxes, the taxes that we pay on our consumption, like the GST. Why are we compelled to have them? Because our income taxes base is very small. So then consumption taxes are regressive because everyone needs to pay them, whether it's the poor or whether the poor buys a toothpaste or I buy a toothpaste, and we both have to pay the same tax, which is an economically inefficient tax. But as governments, you are compelled to have them because your tax base on the income side is very, very low. Direct taxation income base is very low. So the tax reform measures, if you try to track them in the last year, if you try to track the type of tax reform measures that have been taken, from what I understand, is that the underlying objective is to expand the base, to reduce the rate and to expand the base. And that is only the direction that one should move in. That is a better fiscal policy response than actually raising taxes. The other side of raising spending goes without saying. If anything needs to be done, it needs to be raising spending smartly and more effectively in areas which are going to be bang for the buck areas that will translate into the greatest policy effects. And at the same time, raising taxes is going to be completely counterproductive in a recessionary condition or in a health crisis like the condition that we find ourselves in. Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. So this is going to be our last question. It is, what is the extent to which government should limit its intervention? Because inevitably the market models are becoming horribly inefficient. How would you strike a balance between intervention and keeping the markets alive?
That's a very good question, and it's a thinking question. It's a probing question regarding the role of the government in an economy as we move forward across the globe, not just in India. But India was always a mixed economy. If you remember, the commanding heights of the economy were before 1991. And that is what was given up at that point, that we do not need the government to be in sectors where it should not be. Because if you look at the efficiency of the government in terms of performing a lot of services, which are extremely specialized services, then you realize, for instance, telecom is a private sector revolution. The reason why we're able to have these conversations right now is because of extremely cheap digital communication rates. And that is a revolution of the private sector over 3 decades. And of course, at the same time, this has not happened independently of the government. You have seen necessary policy changes that have made it more and more congenial for the telecom sector to grow. So one must never see a sector in isolation from the government. But the government must also not see the sector in isolation of the private sector. It is actually a very, very close relationship. The private sector in itself, even if very efficient in delivering a service or being in a sector, for instance, e-commerce, you would definitely notice that private sector e-commerce platforms are a lot more savvy and a lot more attracted to the consumer than a government e-commerce platform like the GEM platform. Even though that platform is extremely critical for market players, not so much, it's not for consumers, but the consumer platforms for private sector are a lot more attractive, right? But that doesn't mean that you don't need an e-commerce policy, because you know the kind of things that happen on the predatory pricing that takes place on e-commerce platforms that necessarily requires government to intervene and actually have a stringent e-commerce policy. Whether it is, for people like you and I in the coming day and age, who is actually ruling all of us? It's all the digital tech companies, the data companies. This data is the new gold, is the new oil, and it's going to be that for the next 20 to 25 years. Artificial intelligence, machine learning. Now, all of this is being built up by the private sector, but are we talking enough about data policies? Are we talking enough about data regulation, which is extremely critical for our data privacy, right? So any sector in that sense, while the current government definitely has the approach of letting the private sector, facilitating the private sector to actually grow, that is where the PSU policy is also coming in. That is where the privatization policy is also coming in. It must not be visualized as a one sweeping reform where everything is privatized and becomes great. It should be visualized as a much smarter facilitating relationship between the government and the private sector, where the private sector also, that trust deficit between the two gets reduced. Their practices are also a lot more aligned with the final interest towards the consumers or the producers. And at the same time, there is light touch government regulation. There's a term called light touch government regulation, which is neither too much nor too less, which is necessary in certain sectors. But at the same time, there will always be certain sectors which, in my personal opinion, and this is not from an official response, which would require the government sector to be a lot more present than the and especially coming from the human capital side, sectors like health, sectors like education. These sectors, even if you allow a significant private sector presence, which is what is there right now, our health sector is actually a lot more dependent on the private sector than on the government sector. But that gives us no excuse to actually have an inefficient government sector in health, right? So it's important that these particular sectors actually don't just see a facilitating partnership, but actually see equally strong government and private sectors moving together simultaneously, given the kind of needs that we have for our population in the coming 5 to 10 years. So it's a nuanced question. It's a probing one. People can have their personal views on it regarding, it depends on their political ideologies. It's a philosophy question also. So this is a very interdisciplinary question. Role of the government. You can have a full seminar session on this. Role of the government in an economy, and you can have people from philosophy, history, geography, economics, everyone having different views on it. It's a very interesting one. Thank you for that question. And I'd urge all of you to think a lot more about this in terms of what that role should be in the next. But one area where I can definitely probe you in is data. Let's think a lot more about how much these companies are consuming our lives, and what should be the role of the government there. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. That was a really amazing session. And as we are moving towards the very end of the session, I would like to express my gratitude to Sanjana ma'am for taking out time and attending this session. So thank you, ma'am, for coming and enlightening us all.
It's an absolute pleasure, and I wish good health and safety for all of you. Please stay safe, and please feel free to reach out to me at any point. I just like all of you. Now I'm almost forgetting I had to talk a bit about the whole mentoring thing. Actually, mentoring is something that I'm very, very passionate about. So please feel free to reach out to me in terms of any constraints that you're facing in any kind of upskilling, which I think is becoming extremely critical, especially in this online mode of learning that we're seeing ourselves in. I think it becomes important that to consistently motivate ourselves in these difficult times. How do we utilize that time that we have apart from our online sessions to actually upskill? This was something which was not there in my time. And I feel that this can be used as an opportunity. So whether it is in terms of picking up any software, learning a particular software, or picking up any particular skill which is relevant for your career growth, picking that up in addition to your actual college education becomes very critical, and developing communication skills, developing personality development skills, developing interview giving skills. All of these skills can actually be your biggest resource, just like it is for me, is Google. And trust me, you don't need to pay also, because finances is a big constraint for students. It's a constraint for me as well. I also like to go to places where I don't have to pay for everything. If I have to learn more about a particular subject and try and search as much as I can, I rattle my brains into Google and I look for those specific resources which are rich. You have interdisciplinary, inter-university resources. So if, for instance, I want to understand macroeconomics of COVID, I could be reading seminar session policy papers of MIT, of Cornell, of universities across the world, all of them available. You need to follow the right kind of people on the internet, probably lesser celebrities, and more people who are relevant for your career trajectory, who are actually going to be assisting you in terms of the kind of skills that they have grasped over time. So I think that's a good starting point, especially how social media savvy all of you are. Try and follow, whether on Twitter or LinkedIn or any place. Try and follow those people who you feel are the kind of people who you would want to be like, or people who in your industry or your career trajectory have done very well, and then try to map out You map out the skills that they have that you don't have. That's a good starting point to know where to start, because there's just so much out there. It's an overwhelming sea of information, the internet. And to make it sustainable, I think it's important that we still go down to our pen and paper and we map out the skills that we don't have at this particular point of time. And how can we learn them? Then you go step by step for each skill. And you can get those resources. You take assistance from your professors. In college, I'm sure they'll be more than happy to assist you. But at your stage, I think from what I remember, is the one thing that I thought that I consistently did was to keep my curiosity high. I never let it is still extremely high. I hope it always stays high. Even when I am 80 years old, I still feel that I know nothing and there is so much that I need to know. So I think just staying very, very curious about things that are happening around you, and trying to know a lot more in a structured manner. Then be curious and then be structured. So like I said, follow people, get the skills, get what they have, and then map out why I don't have this. Is it because of my education? If yes, then how can I grasp it? Either through my professor or through anyone. Like, if you feel free to reach out to me if you feel that I am relevant to your career trajectory. And I could definitely assist you in specific skills that you may need and how you can get them. Because I'm from a particular field, and I'm sure the audience is from very, very different fields. I think what becomes common across students is A, curiosity, and B, being structured in what you need. Use the internet. It's a resource. It's an unimaginable resource, and you don't need a lot of money to use it as well. You have free courses everywhere to actually grasp skills. Microsoft Excel, a skill that you need irrespective of the discipline that you belong to. Political science, history, sociology, any job that you do out there will still need some analytics, and you have no idea how much can be done in Excel. We really downplay MS Word now with all these fancy statistical packages that have come in. But I think even having very, very strong skills in them is a good starting point. So I can go on this, but I feel that the audience is very, very differentiated across disciplines. Two things: curiosity, structured approach to the skills that you don't have, follow the people that you feel you want to be like, emulate, not idolize them, but try and emulate the good things that they have. And lastly, just stay positive.
Thank you.
So it's an absolute pleasure. Please stay safe and have a good evening. Bye bye.
Waiting Dipali ma'am's confirmation if she has joined yet or not. I see an account named, I see a couple of accounts named from Dipali ji. I'm not sure if it's of Dipali ma'am. Let me get back.
Hello? No, it's not done. They can't hear me. Hi, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you.
Excellent. Very good. So this is what tech glitches are about, which can, lead the best plans of mice and men to go agly. So very good. So now let's, so for today, I chose to discuss with you the pandemic, which is on everybody's mind, and what are the policy choices which we confront in the pandemic. And I will also tell you a little bit more about the Reserve Bank, where possibly you know that I worked for well, what you will think of as an entire lifetime, all of 36 years. So what do you see when I use the word pandemic? What do you feel?
Before you begin, ma'am, so
Yeah.
hello, ma'am. I am Dr.
Hi.
Arnav from college.
Hi,
So
Dr.
please give
Arnav.
us yes, ma'am. Please give us a pleasure of introducing you a bit.
Thank you.
Some are new people. So our just 2 minutes, ma'am, and
Please,
then
take your time.
platform will be yours. Yes, Rishika, I think you are going ahead. Yes. Yeah. Please introduce the ma'am first, and then we will.
I can't hear you.
You don't have to be great to start, but you have to start to be great. Such great and amazing personalities are here with us this time to imbibe us with knowledge and enlighten our minds. This is the purpose, the vision behind organizing Zenith 21, the annual finance convention. A very warm good evening to everyone present. On behalf of Finjan family, I welcome you all in today's session. In the ongoing series of keynote sessions being organized by Finjan, the Finance and Investment Cell of Ramanujan College, it gives me immense pleasure to accord a hearty welcome to Dr. Dipali Pant Joshi, an economist par excellence, the former executive director at RBI, speaker at reputed platforms, was chief general manager at Hyderabad. Dr. Joshi has many more feathers in her cap. Now, I would request our convener, Sir Dr. Arnav Kumar, to address us with his words of wisdom.
That's it, Rishika. We just welcome, ma'am, and it is pleasure, ma'am, to have you. And in the pandemic, you spare time for us, ma'am. Our students are all waiting, and they would like to hear from you, ma'am. All over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. And Rishika retired as executive director of the RBI, and I was executive director for 5 years. So I was telling you that when I use the very word pandemic, P you associate with panic, pandemic. Well, let's not panic about it, but let's accept that it is the biggest public health challenge which we as a country are facing. And then let's look forward. You're all pretty young, and maybe not, you've read Charles Dickens. So there is this book which I like very much, which is called A Tale of Two Cities. And this is how it begins. It says, it was the best of times. It was the worst of times. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. So the situation today is something like that. And so we are faced with what we economists sometimes call a black swan event. Something which no one anticipated. No one thought about it. We worried about different issues. We worried about Brexit. We worried about inflation. We worried about oil price. Nobody thought that there could be something which today we are even afraid, maybe bioterrorism. Why is it that the whole world is afraid today? Why do we sit indoors? Why do I not come and meet you personally? Why do I hesitate to shake hands with you, to hug anybody? Why? What has happened to the world? What has gone wrong? Something very fundamental has happened, and that something has changed the world. Now, people try to draw parallels between 2008 and the present. That we cannot do. Because what we saw then was something we understood, which we could model. It was a global financial crisis. And we understood the reasons for that, and we found solutions for it, and we were able to guard against it. We are now on uncharted seas, and the pandemic has shown us, as a country, our challenges and what are the weak spots in our own economy. So first is very poor infrastructure. Second is weak and excessive regulation. You know, it's a question of like missing the wood for the trees. So you go after every little thing, but you ignore the big thing, which is going to blow up in your face anytime. Then we have too small a manufacturing sector. We have absolutely no social safety nets. And we have a workforce, we have a large workforce, which is unskilled, illiterate, and we have a complete failure of governance. So the first thing in all this litany of woes I would put is the need to create jobs and employment. So first of all, India needs to create jobs and employment because it has to harness the skills of its young population. If we do not succeed in doing this with immediacy, what do we say today? What do we say is the biggest advantage of this country? It's a demographic bonus. But from the word bonus, if I remove the word B, what does it become? It becomes a very big onus. So a demographic dividend is because we have very bright, very young, working age population like all of you. But if we cannot give you jobs, if we cannot harness your skills, if we cannot harness the skills of people across the country, then we are in deep, deep trouble. And let me make no bones about it, because in my lexicon, this in my argot comes first. Let us create jobs. We do not want, you see, we say that China, because it had a one-child norm, doesn't have young people. We say Europe is aging, all true. But we have the people, if they do not have skills, if they do not have education, if they do not have jobs, what will they turn to? What alternative will they have except a life of crime? We do not want favelas like in Mexico. Now, today there are very wide disparities, you see, and access to TV and social media is just increasing these disparities. Because you see on social media, you see that there is a phone, it's an Apple iPhone, it's got a gold plating, it costs a lakh. You want that phone. Why should you not have that phone, you feel? So how will you get it? Let's snatch it if I can't get it. Let's go to a store. Let's lift an Adidas shoe. So, I mean, and therefore, the gap between the haves and the have-nots is widening. And this is not a good portent. You see, long ago, Gunnar Myrdal wrote a book where he talked about a revolution of rising expectations. That is aspirations. Now, the aspirations of people must translate into achievements. And therefore, we must give them an ability to achieve their aspirations through employment, through jobs, and a regular income stream. So instead of widening disparities, we should make every attempt for bridging these disparities. So therefore, the second thing we need to focus on as a country is to create very strong infrastructure, because that will always have a multiplier effect on growth. What am I talking about? Multiplier effect in growth. If you create a road in a village, that road allows you to move your goods. That road connects you with the world. If you create a digital autobahn, you're plugged into the entire world. You can now, there are housewives who are selling pickles and papads on the internet. They are earning. There are students who, I am able to talk to you with a little glitch, I admit, at the beginning, but nevertheless, we can connect and we can have this lovely chat. And I can see what a wonderful thing you're doing. Even in the pandemic, you've shown guts, you've shown courage, and you've organized this Zenith. So the minute I got your invitation, I thought I absolutely must accept, because this is the spirit which we must encourage, which these kids are showing. I mean, the spirit of optimism, the spirit of hope, the spirit that everything is fine, everything is going to be fine. And on the learning curve, one thing we are not going to do, we are not going to slacken. So I'm going to bore you for a bit more. So I also told you that manufacturing is a weak spot, because why? Manufacturing gives the biggest jobs, which people are moving out of farming, so they need jobs in manufacturing. So we need to put a lot more money into it. I mean, let's take your Maruti car. It needs hubcaps, it needs windshield wipers, it needs mats, it needs a body. So it needs so many things, all of which are in the supply chain manufactured by different people. And these manufacturing is what gave China the advantage. So whether it's a safety pin or whether it's a car or an airplane, it's manufacturing, it's setting up these supply chains, which is going to create the jobs which I was talking about for the skilled, for the unskilled, for the literate, for the illiterate, from the automobile engineer to the man who pushes the tires to the car. So the third thing you need to do is, there is a large amount of your population which is engaged in agriculture. But that is subsistence agriculture where you're just managing to eke out a livelihood. So that population you have to bring to the city and you have to create jobs for them. So what I mean is that you need, what I'm coming to is a skill and effective capacity building program, which will build the necessary capabilities for integrating with the emerging job market. Then, of course, very importantly, the pandemic has shown you that you need to increase the pace of digitization. Digitization has proved its effectiveness during the course of these days, these difficult days. It has created efficiencies in the delivery of goods and services, and it needs to be widened, it needs to be deepened, it needs to be exponentially increased. So you have a very simple, you have jam and bread for breakfast. What does jam stand for? Your Jan Dhan, your Aadhaar, and your mobile. So on this tripod of jam, and I want you to really remember this jam, you have allowed benefits to percolate to the poor. There are no leaky buckets. You're just targeting the right people and in their bank accounts. So Jan Dhan is the zero banking account. Aadhaar is the proof of identity and the distinction between BPL and APL. And on these three things, you are able to target women-headed households and poorer people. So you need to ensure social safety nets. Because as I said, if you don't have a social safety net, your maid, your driver, your mali are all going to turn to crime. You have to have inclusive economic growth while ensuring macroeconomic stability, because otherwise there will be a revolution, there will be a disruption, and society as you have known it will change. Now, you have all seen images of poor migrants trekking to their villages. Today, they have gone very fatalistically. Tomorrow, the same migrants will knock down your door and enter your houses. First, they will beg for food, then they will snatch food. So you, as a society, you can't live for 1% of the people. You have to work for inclusive growth, because a country which does not have inclusive economic growth, which does not take everyone along, is a country which is not progressing, which is not growing in a healthy way, it's just economic growth is stalled in that country, I would say. Now, everybody talks about the central bank by being the only game in town, but that's not strictly true. However, it plays a very critical role in the Indian economy, and that is the Reserve Bank of India. Its role gains even greater salience in aiding the resumption of economic activity, because it gives you remissions on the loans which you've taken. It reduces the interest rate on which borrowing can take place. So it's doing its damnedest. Just as if you're going home from tuition and your bike stalls, you've got to kick it 3 or 4 times to ensure that the kachra goes away and the petrol flows. So likewise, the RBI is trying its damnedest to kickstart the economy by keeping all the interest rates low. And the gain to the, you see, what does the financial sector do? What does your bank do? You have savers on one side, you have borrowers on the other side. So it matches the needs of savers and borrowers as an efficient intermediary. So the gain to the economy will depend largely on how the financial sector, how efficiently, and when we economists use the word efficient, we mean with a minimum of expense, how quickly, how swiftly, how timely is your intermediation, and how quickly are you able to do this. And you have to now follow a supply leading approach. Wherever you see there is a demand, you have to go there and you have to help, you have to handhold, and you have to ensure that the industries come out of the pandemic and there is an economic revival. Now, there are uncertainties, there are exogenous factors. Well, you know, exogenous is exo, outside. Exogenous is a global factor. We do not know how COVID-19 is going to play out in the world. We do not know what impact that is going to have on our country. Now, let me explain. There are 2 things which your country needs badly, which all of us need. One is absolutely vital, and one is completely unnecessary. So absolutely vital is oil, because we don't have oil in our country. Now, what is absolutely inessential? I don't know if Barnali, Diksha, Shraddha, Shubham, and Abhishek are wearing any gold. But a lot of people I see wearing gold earrings, wearing gold bangles. Gold is the unnecessary import. So gold is something which the country is crazy about. Why is it unnecessary? Because it adds to your import bill. So next time, any of you boys wants to wear a thick gold chain, desist. And you want to buy your girlfriends on Valentine's Day a gold ring, desist. Buy a book instead. It's cheaper, you know, and she might be happier with it. And the country will definitely benefit more. So now, you have 3 urgent challenges. What are those? One is growth, inflation dynamic. If you grow at a scorching pace, you do anything at a scorching pace, inflation rises. What is the meaning of inflation rising? Earlier, when Rishika, you took, let us say, you took Manan out. Why should gender be the other way around? So when you took him out and bought him a pizza, it probably cost you $1,000. Today, the same pizza is going to cost you $1,500, and he'll think you a cheapskate if you don't buy him a cold drink with it, and the cost of going there. So now it's going to come very expensive for you to take him out. So you play the gender card and let him take you out. But that is the growth inflation dynamic. Secondly is the vulnerability of your external sector. Now, if the rest of the world is not growing, who are you going to sell your products to? You can't export because there are no buyers for your export, or at any rate, there are no buyers who are going to pay you ready money. And no one in the world believes in credit anymore. The third is fiscal expansionism. That is a little difficult, but I'll explain that too. It simply means, you know, when we were children, our parents told us, cut your coat according to your cloth. Now, Rishika, to come back to poor Manan Arora, whom you're taking out. Now, if you have a pocket money of 500, but you've decided to take him out, then you're going to borrow from Shraddha, you're going to borrow from Diksha, and you're going to borrow from Barnali. So if you borrow $5,000 and your pocket money is only 500, then it's a kind of fiscal expansionism, because you're not cutting your coat according to your cloth. You have a great date and you have a handsome boyfriend. But the short point is that it's not going to help in the long run. Manan, don't feel shy, please. Always girls are made to feel shy. I'm just joking, beta. But the short point is, this is what fiscal expansionism is. When you as an individual or you as a country begin living beyond your means. That is, if you say, hello, hi, whether I want the money, RBI go print more notes for me. The notes don't just fly in the air. Notes have to be set off against gold, against something or the other. So now let me sum up what I've said so far before we segue into the way forward. What I've said is that the crisis which we are facing today highlights the need for urgent public health action and for urgent recovery. Which we are going to face, we have to protect the vulnerable populations and also maybe never ever cite newspapers of poor and helpless migrants dying on the railway track. Let's not see this. May the recovery and the economic rebound, may all of you, when you become working age people, may all of you set the stage for a lasting economic growth trajectory, which will have growth with equity. And this is something I want you to remember, because only the realization of this will make India a great nation. Agreed? Okay. So you will try to work for growth with equity. Having said that, let us see what has happened in the pandemic and what are the upsides and downsides of what has happened, right? Even I'm working from home right now. What does that do? This is the new norm. We call it the WFH. The good thing which it does is you are more productive. You spend less time in the grinding commute. But what do you miss? You miss out on locker room gossip. You miss out on human interactions. You miss out on a cup of coffee. You miss out on basic chatting with people. You miss out with bonding. I mean, after all, we are not all like kind of zombies. We're not like Sherlock Holmes that we just sit in isolation. We like a chat. We like a laugh. And all of that goes away from our day. And secondly, there are more demands of housework. I mean, if I was your mother, I'd say, look, I've been washing dishes all afternoon. Who's going to chip in? So Abhishek wants to watch this lovely film, but at the same time, he has this conflict. He has to help his mother, he has to help his auntie, and he has to watch the film. Then I tell Diksha that this house has not been dusted in centuries. Your father has a dust allergy. Now she just wants to call up Shraddha and have a lovely chat, but she can't. Because that, so again is that approach conflict. So if you're working from home, there are these new conflicts which there never were. And if you're a woman and a slightly older woman, and if you are married and if you have children, there are times when you just like to be by yourself. You like the workplace. It gives you a space of your own. So it's a question of a blurring of boundaries between public spaces and private spaces. So therefore, there's a downside. There's an upside, there's a downside. Social interactions do not happen. Your official meetings, your FinJam, where you used to have such a whale of a time. Now there's going to be no music, there's going to be no dance, there's going to be no live performance. There are going to be boring economic lectures by Dr. Dipali Joshi, and you're forced to listen to them. But this is life, I mean, you might just get something out of this. Media usage has exploded. It's through media that we are able to interact with each other. The 60 and stayed like me only switched on television to watch the 9 o'clock news. Now I am an ardent Netflixer. Whenever I get time, I ask my kids, what are you watching? What should I be watching? And there are new things which you're finding, which is all that the media is doing for you. In the morning, I used to walk around till I got my newspaper. Now I have a digital paper. And all these pings which you hear, I am actually, this phone is like a handcuff, because either it's a WhatsApp message, or it's Finjan calling me, or it's something or the other, which will keep you engaged and busy all the time. So you're never free to have a conversation with a very important person. And you know who that person is? That's yourself. You have no time for yourself. You are accessible to the entire world, but you're not accessible to yourself. You can't look at the guy in the mirror and think about what he's thinking, because there are 1,000 other things which are happening together. Also, life has become much easier. Microwave ovens, dishwashers, these are all flying off the shelves. There are also robots who do your jhadu pocha for you. So there are a lot of new innovations which are happening, and a lot of things which are keeping you engaged. Education has changed. When you were small, you looked forward to going to play with your friends. Now you have a play group for your 4-year-old, which is on the like a Zoom call. You have a play group and you're learning, but the interaction is not there. So I am not able to hear you people. I am speaking with you. I can see from your facial expressions that you're listening very attentively, and I'm very flattered. But the short point is, we are not able to talk. We are not able to meet physically. You don't know what kind of person I am. I don't know what you like, what makes you tick. So the same way, education is something which, like an injection of remdesivir, is being sort of administered to you. There's no fun left in it. Now, a lot of sectors of the economy are going out. So let's discuss what's out and what's in. Automobiles, aviation services, because no one's flying, everyone's scared. Aviation, hospitality, tourism, hotels, they have slowed down. There are no conferences, there are no large meets, ballrooms are empty, the chandeliers are gathering dust, all the sofas are dust, they've got jackets. Of course, it's big ticket, as in research and development. And there's also a lot of connectivity enabled growth. So there's a lot of innovation happening, and these are now the new sunrise sectors. Like, I've been a banker, as I told you. So earlier we used to have physical banks, which were called brick and mortar banks. And it used to be a very big thing for a bank to have a number of branches. Like, you went everywhere, you saw SBI. Now the same thing is like a millstone around your neck, because you're paying for all those branches, while you can have a bank just with your mobile. You can have a bank in a box just with a banking correspondent. So these are the new things which have happened through innovation. So banking has changed fundamentally. Now you all do e-banking, and there are online payment platforms, there are loan platforms, there's crowdsourced loaning, and there's disintermediation and competition for the banks from these sectors, because it's faster, it's quicker. The interest rate may, of course, be higher, but when you're young and you have your life ahead of you and you want to go on that dream holiday to Paris, you don't really give a damn at that stage. Or you want to go and study at the Sorbonne, or you want to go to Cambridge, or you want to go to Harvard. You needn't even do that. You can just sit at home and pay for an American education, but learn online in the privacy of your home with food your mom cooks for you. So life in that sense has changed. Now, payment systems are also big ticket now. There are payment aggregators, there are payment banks, and these are things which were just not heard of as late as 5 years back. Now the RBI says there are real-time gross settlements, and there is a national electronic fund transfer which happens 24/7 and which is free. You transfer money over your phone. You have a mobile wallet which you use. So Rishika, you won't have to be tense. You can just use your mobile wallet and make whatever payments you want. And I do trust some of you still go to bookshops and spend money on books, because my entire life, I've spent money only on books and music. So all of that, you can hear Bach, you can hear Mozart, you can hear Bhimsen Joshi, and you can hear the latest in hip hop, and Simon and Garfunkel. You can hear anything on earth. Everything is accessible at the touch of a button. More importantly, pandemic planning and monitoring has become very important. You do that through the Arogya Setu app, and you know who near you has COVID, which is the nearest hospital to contact, where are beds available, where is oxygen available. All this usage, this harnessing is being done because of the pandemic. And just today I read in the paper that there was this young girl whose mother was ill. And she was in Hyderabad. She wanted to know where beds are free. So she developed an app, which is being widely used now, by which you can find out where the resources are available. So this is something absolutely new. Now this telemedicine is also there. So there are online consultations. They say these are, people send you mail and they say, okay, this is what you must do. And if I raise my hand, you can see already that my strap is telling me that I've been idle now and I should start walking to do my 6,000 steps. And so you can monitor your health, you can monitor your steps, your pulse rate, your heart rate, everything on a smartwatch, which was not there earlier. So you're reaching an inflection point for increase in technology, and we have a digital mission. So what is increasing? Let me say that internet usage is the first thing which has really increased. Secondly, there's been this e-media explosion, which we just talked about. Then there's e-commerce. Every day at your house, Amazon is sending you something with the other, which you're ordering online. Then there's e-education, which we talked about, and there is e-banking. Now, the problem is that this is further deepening the divide which I talked about. So there's going to be digital apartheid. And this digital apartheid is also going to be between people of my generation and people of your generation. For instance, when I got stuck and I didn't know how to enter, I had to furiously bang on my son's door to request me to help me get in, to be able to start a conversation, because I could see the frisson of anxiety on your faces, that why was I not coming in? And I didn't realize that there was just a button I had to press. So a lot more of literacy is needed, a lot more of digital literacy is a very dangerous and difficult thing. Let's talk about financial exclusion. I talked about the Jan Dhan account, okay, through which we are including people, poorer people. So exclusion means it's not just an exclusion from a banking system or a payment system. Now, if you're excluded from a payment system, what happens is that if you are working in Mumbai and if your family is from, say your family is from Tirupur in Tamil Nadu or Kuch Bihar in West Bengal, and you need to send them money, what do? You know, you look for someone going home. If someone's going home to Kuch Bihar in the Pujo holidays, then you ask him and he physically carries the money. But it takes a very long time for your family to get it. And there are three problems. He says it got lost in the way, it got stolen, and he charges a very hefty commission for it. But if you build a remittance corridor, then it's and when you want to send money, you just press a button on your cell and hey presto, the other person at the other end has received the money immediately. So that's happening in real time. So imagine this is happening in real time, and that poor man who has worked so hard to save that, or that poor woman, 200 to 250 rupees, has to send it and has to pay for the privilege, has to pay a hefty amount for the privilege. Then it is also exclusion from a formal credit market. You want an education loan, you step into a bank and you ask for an education loan, and you fill the 5,055 forms in a second, and you get your loan if you have the certificates and and etc. But if you're poor, you get no loans. Then, but you still need money. So where do you get the money from? You have access to everything. What I'm trying to say is you do have access. You can send that money. It costs just a lot more. And you're not in a position to bargain. So you go to the informal credit market. That is, you go to a money lender who charges a humongous amount of interest, but you could get that very easily if you were financially included. So if you are, formalization in an economy means mainstreaming the marginalized, making everybody a producer of goods and a consumer of goods. Because if you produce goods which are sold and you get money, you also become a consumer of goods. Now you have a country which is huge. Who used to say it's huge, man? The former US president who got kicked out. But here you really have a country of subcontinental, it's not a Trumpism when I say that it's huge, because your country is a country of subcontinental proportions. You have barriers of geography. You have mountains, hills, coastal region. You have regions where tsunami comes. You have region where ice flows come. So you don't know what to do with geography. You have absolutely zero infrastructure. You have large number of poor people, and poor people have a fear factor. They don't like to sign all these forms. If you take their thumbprint, they are certain they're going to land in jail. Even if you're giving them money and that money is coming in their accounts, they want to self-exclude because they're just afraid, because they're illiterate, because they're uneducated. So this is called, the pandemic has shown us very sharply, and we must move to address. Because even when the government announced that in women-headed households, you will be getting a lot of money, 500 rupees, women were reluctant or afraid to take that money because they didn't know why they were getting it and what would happen to it. Then what else has increased? So what is important is to address this issue. It is also very important. Just a few days back, we celebrated Earth Day. And now everyone talks of the need for oxygen. And everybody says that in metros, you can't breathe because no one has plants on their table anymore. Environmental consciousness and the fact that we are leaving a carbon footprint behind. Now, Manan will tell me every time, print this mail only if you need to print it. Because your carbon footprint is swallowing the planet and you're creating an intergenerational debt. Because those who are going to come after you, they will not know what roses are. Leave alone being able to smell the roses, being able to enjoy a garden, a quiet walk, a pond, a swim. These are things we are now very, very conscious of, which we were not till the pandemic. Nobody focused on climate change. It was just some dialogues going on, some Paris dialogue, something esoteric happening somewhere in the world. So the world has seen fundamental changes, and now there is a completely new economic paradigm. And what can you do for that? See, as I said, India is a country which everyone is looking at because you have the potential to grow exponentially because you are young. You have your future before you. Before me, I see bureaucrats, I see innovators, I see engineers. In all of you, I see artists. I see beautiful people, beautiful young people who have their lives ahead of them, who are going to not only take this country on an economic trajectory, they are going to take the world forward. You see, as someone once said, we don't have the luxury of choosing our challenges. We can't choose our challenges. They are thrust at us, but we do have the luxury of being able to fight those battles, our battles, and to get ahead and to build a bridge to the future. So Ramanujam College, I am very happy to be addressing you in Zenith, and I leave you with the hope and the promise that you will be that bridge to the future. And it is you I look for future happiness, for future delight. And I wish you all a very bright future, because in your bright future lies just not the future of this country, but believe me, the future of the globe and the world as we will know it in the new economic paradigm. So thank you very much for a very patient hearing. I've loved being with you. I'd love any questions if there are any. Okay.
Your words have been truly inspiring.
Thank you, ma'am, for engaging Thank you, ma'am, for engaging students. And this was the last session of 2 days, but you can see their smiling faces. They are so happy, informed, and you personally engaged them along with other volunteers. And ma'am, we would definitely like to have you on campus also, if the situation permits in future. And then we would like to interact and engage with you personally. Thank you.
Okay, I'll send you my email. You have my email. Anybody wants
yes,
to send me a mail, you're very welcome. Okay?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
I will
Sure.
reply.
But ma'am, we would like you to take a couple of questions, ma'am.
Oh, certainly. Please. Pleasure.
Yes.
We have some questions on the board. The first question.
Rishika, just a little louder, Rishika. Ma'am, then we'll be able to comfortably hear you. Thoda sa louder.
No.
Audible now?
Yeah,
Yes.
it is better.
With the reference to
you're a woman of substance. Come on. Put some strength in your voice.
With reference to RBI's efforts in reviving the economy, lowering the interest rates constantly might trigger a liquidity trap. So how can the economy stay at bay from it?
Wonderful, wonderful. I never expected such a great question, such a brilliant question. Yes. How will we avert a liquidity trap? Liquidity trap, yes, but there are many things which the RBI has in its arsenal. So first of all, you have to understand that on the 20th of February, RBI entered into an agreement with the government of India. Earlier, the RBI used to have many goals. Here we decided that there will be a monetary policy framework, and the one goal will be the control of inflation, by which inflation will be within a band of 4% plus minus 2%. That is, it cannot exceed 6%. So if there's a liquidity trap, there is necessarily inflation. And if this happens, the RBI will have to explain to the government of India what happened, why, in some क्यों हुआ, कैसे हुआ, कब हुआ, and what are we going to do to stop it. So what is the estimated time frame over which we will bring inflation back to target? So RBI has now become a inflation targeting central bank, and this inflation targeting has been formally accepted in India. So there is no real danger of a liquidity trap, but there is a danger that if you do not inject enough liquidity at this stage, and we have various instruments, we have the repo rate, which is the short-term interest rate, through which we do this. Otherwise, there will be a great problem, and we will not be able to influence our liquidity and our interest rates. And that is what a central bank does. It does open market operations to stanch excess liquidity from the market and to avoid liquidity traps. So there is also a liquidity adjustment facility which we have, and we have short-term goals and we have long-term goals for the growth of the economy in the long term. So I see no danger of a liquidity trap happening, because before a liquidity trap happens, we know what's going on. If credit is not being picked up, and we will be able to stop that. Okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Ma'am, the next question for you is,
hi, Rishika, anything more?
Inflation in these COVID times is a much bigger barrier for many people, as many people are spending from their savings and not having enough earnings. So how can we cope up with the situation of inflation for helping them people to survive?
No, there is no actual link between inflation. The danger is more of recession. When people are not able to spend enough and people are dependent on their savings. So what are we doing? We first segment. So we've talked a lot about poorest of poor, and I've told you that there are 500 rupees which are being, which is a little palliative, but it's coming in their account. But let's talk now of richy rich. So what are we doing for the large companies? For the large companies, we gave them a lot of remissions, which made it very easy for them. We allowed them to file their income tax returns. We almost gave a tax holiday for a year to the large companies. Then we gave them a lot of stimulus packages. There was something called the Atmanirbhar program, through which we addressed the middle to strengthen the infrastructure. We gave them 63,343 crores in 5-6 tranches. We did a lot for the MSME sector. We gave them 3 trillion collateral-free automatic loans with cover, and their statutory provident fund covers, employee provident fund, which we said, no, you needn't contribute right away. So we've done, and there are a lot of, for migrant workers, again, as I said, 3,500 crore was set aside for food grain, so that at least people won't starve, for street vendors, for tribals, and a lot of has been done for infrastructure industries like the coal industry, the aviation industry, defense production, and social infrastructure. So there's something called M-Narika, which you heard of. So we've increased the allocations for that. When I say we, I mean the government. So yes, a lot is being done. So a lot of support is being given, but yes, it's going to be a long haul and a tough haul. So on the 7th of April, RBI announced its monetary policy. And it said that it will have an accommodative stance. Now, an accommodative stance means it will follow an easy money policy. It will do all it takes and for as long as it takes for economic growth to kickstart and move into a higher trajectory. Okay.
Answered, ma'am. I, on behalf of all present here, express my heartfelt gratitude to you. Thank you for taking time for us from your precious time. The deep wisdom, the profound knowledge, and the sheer expertise. This convention was not being enlightening, but also inspiring. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Rishika and Manan and Banali and Shubham and Anikesh, Abhishek, Diksha, Shraddha, and Dr. Arnav Kumar. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye. And any time for you guys. How do I leave?
There will be an end button towards the end. She has left. So all the participants are requested to leave the meeting so that we can begin with our insider session.